Welcome, everyone. A very, very warm welcome to you all. I'm Cynthia Lazaroff, and I welcome you all this morning from the island of Kauai with deep gratitude to the Hawaiian peoples and their ancestors, the original stewards of this land. I want to thank you, each and every one of you who are joining us from across many time zones around the world for our program on journalism, media, and our nuclear legacy, the stakes, challenges, and opportunities. Looking at registration this morning, you join us from 22 countries, including 7 of the 9 nuclear armed states. Thank you so much for caring and for being here. I'm thrilled that we have 4 truly extraordinary women with us today who will be sharing their wisdom and who are all dedicated to transforming our nuclear legacy. Rachel Bronson, Elena Chernenko, lovely Umayam, and Katrina vanden Heuvel. Our program today is a collaboration with the American Committee for U.S.-Russia Accord, with special thanks to Katrina. I also want to express my deep gratitude to the Plowshares Fund Women's Initiative for their generous support in making this program possible. Plowshares has been leading the quest to eliminate nuclear weapons since they got started 40 years ago. And Plowshares founder Sally Lilienthal dedicated her life and heart and soul to this. We wouldn't be here without Sally, and we wouldn't be here without Plowshares. Now I'd like to welcome my dear friend and teacher, beloved elder in our community on Kauai, Kumu Hula Puna Dawson, who will open our session with a blessing. Puna travels the world, sharing the spirit of aloha, building bridges for peace between the peoples of the Hawaiian Islands and the peoples of other countries. Aloha, Auntie Puna, welcome. And we would be so grateful for you to share your blessing now.
Aloha kakahiaka. Pehe oko. Nice way to say, how are all of you? We're all part of this beautiful existence of time. And we're connected by the 8 oceans that surround our earth. May we take the time now, all of us, to breathe into our hands, please. Breathe into our hands that holds the breath of our ancestral history. Lift it up and let this breath surround the earth as we know it. One world, one essence, all in this time, sharing moment to moment, all of our families. I encourage all of us to understand the true translation of Hawaii. Ha is this breath. Why is the birth waters that we come from, each one of us. And Iona Lani is that universal good, or pono. I'm in awe of all that is present at this time, because you stand in this truth. From the different parts of our earth, we share in this ocean of time. Being Hawaiian is being responsible, and that is what each one of you has committed to being and is. Being Hawaiian is taking care of what we have that was taken care of by our ancestors. And now it's our turn to ensure this for all those that will come after us. Being here in this moment, in our culture, we say hula. Hula is a motion and movement from moment to moment in life. So when they say hula is life, this is what we describe. May we be the connection that brings life and light throughout the world. May we be the connection that continues to shower our earth with grace and truth. May we be the connection that makes all that is in our hands, all the responsibilities that we hold. May we be the one to help to issue in the grace, the glory, the appreciation of mankind, being kind one to another. In all these things we say, aloha. Mahalo. Blessings.
Thank you, dear Auntie Puna. May it be so. So grateful to you for bringing us all together at the beginning like this. Mahalo. Last week, the Nobel Committee awarded the Peace Prize to journalists Maria Ressa and Dmitry Muratov, citing the critical role of free, independent, and fact-based journalism to protect us against, quote, war propaganda and to successfully promote disarmament. With their reference to disarmament, the committee recognized the crucial role journalism has to play in the future of our nuclear legacy. When the Cold War came to an end, I thought I could stop worrying about nuclear war. All of that changed for me in 2017 when I went to work on the film US-Russia Relations: Quest for Stability and interviewed dozens of top experts on nuclear dangers. Pretty much everyone I spoke to awakened me to today's staggering nuclear danger. The two who had the greatest impact on me were former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and US former Secretary of Defense William Perry. Secretary Perry said to me that today we're at a greater risk of a nuclear catastrophe than we were during the Cold War, and that most people are blissfully unaware of this danger. And then he turned to me and he said, "We're sleepwalking into a nuclear catastrophe. We must wake up." At a time when many experts are sounding this alarm, journalists are largely sleepwalking on nuclear issues, seemingly focused on everything else but the end of life as we know it. So it's with humility that I open this session with a few questions that plague me. First, what's it going to take to awaken the media from their sleepwalking and fulfill their ethical responsibility to inform us on the clear and present nuclear danger, as they did during the Cold War? Is it going to take the unthinkable, as some have said to me, the first use of a nuclear weapon since 1945? I can't accept this. So I ask, what positive steps can we take that could be game-changing? What are the creative ways to break through, to touch hearts, open minds, engage the wider journalist community and the public, and join together to change our nuclear story before it's too late? In her compelling new book, Cassandra Speaks, best-selling author Elizabeth Lesser says, when women are the storytellers, the human story changes. Excluding women, half of the human race, from the story of nuclear decision-making and policy-making for most of the nuclear age, has brought us to the brink of possible extinction. We're here today because it's an existential imperative that we write a new nuclear story. And the four remarkable women we have with us today are all doing just that, each in her own way, using the power of the pen and art to awaken and inspire us to act, to change our nuclear story. So with that, I'd like to welcome and introduce our speakers. Rachel Bronson is the president and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. She oversees the publishing programs, management of the doomsday clock, and a growing set of activities around nuclear risk, climate change, and disruptive technologies. Since its inception in the aftermath of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Bulletin has been sounding the alarm on nuclear dangers now for 76 years, informing us with the voices of the most knowledgeable experts in the world, setting a gold standard for journalism, keeping us awake to what's at stake day after day, year after year, like nobody else. Rachel, I don't know what we'd do without the Bulletin, which is going to new heights under your inspiring leadership. I've heard you referred to by your colleagues as a force of nature. So we're thrilled to have you with us. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you.
Elena Chernenko is the special correspondent at the Russian daily Kommersant. Elena is a cybersecurity, cyber diplomacy, non-proliferation, arms control, nuclear, and foreign policy expert, a leading journalist in Russia reporting on nuclear issues and their impact on US-Russia relations. She's also a member of the Presidium of the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy and serves on the executive board of the Peer Center Council. Elena, I just want to say it's been a privilege to get to know you and your work over the past few years. You're one of the few women operating in nuclear policy in Russia. You bring both extraordinary rigor and humanity to your journalism, and you're widely respected for reporting there and also here in the West. Remarkably, somehow you do all this as the mother of 2 toddlers. I don't know how you do it. Welcome, Elena. We're so happy to have you with us. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you very much, Cynthia.
Lovely Umayam is a writer, nuclear nonproliferation expert, and founder of the Bombshell Policy and Arts Collective, a creative organization pushing for an active exploration of arts, culture, and history to promote nuclear nonproliferation, arms control, and disarmament. Lovely is also a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center, where she conducts research on technologies like blockchain and their potential applications for tracking nuclear materials and protecting related facilities. Lovely. It's been a joy and privilege to immerse myself in your truly breathtaking work these past weeks preparing for this session. Your gift of words, your stunning visual expressions, your dedication to giving voice and agency to those most deeply impacted by nuclear weapons. All of this and so much more. You've moved me to tears, and as an elder, you bring me great hope and inspiration for the future. Welcome, Lovely. We're honored to have you with us.
Thank you so much for the kind words, Cynthia, and I'm happy to be here.
Katrina vanden Heuvel is editorial director and publisher of The Nation, a frequent commentator on US and international politics for ABC, MSNBC, CNN, and PBS. She writes a weekly column for the Washington Post. Katrina has been a leading voice on progressive issues for decades, has been recognized for her journalism and public service by numerous organizations, and serves as president of the American Committee for US-Russia Accord. Katrina, I'm deeply grateful for all you've given over so many decades to US-Soviet and now US-Russia relations. You've been sounding the alarm on nuclear dangers since the Cold War, courageously calling for a breakup of the military-industrial complex, contributing your eloquent voice to catalyzing a national and international conversation on the existential need to restore dialogue, diplomacy, humanity, and sanity to US-Russia relations. Welcome, Katrina, with deep gratitude for all you're doing.
Grateful to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
So Rachel, I'd like to start with you, the first question as we open. In 2020, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists set the doomsday clock to 100 seconds to midnight, the closest it's ever been in history, and this year announced the clock would remain at 100 seconds. Rachel, if you could tell us about the doomsday clock, why it's at 100 seconds, closer to the apocalypse than ever before, and how does the doomsday clock serve to awaken the media and the public, and how has it served to advance the Bulletin's mission as it has evolved over time?
Cynthia, thank you for that question, the introduction, and for the honor of being part of this panel of just such incredible women. It's a privilege, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity. I want to do it just a bit of a sound check. Is my background okay? There's not much I can do, but I want to make sure you can hear me okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, so thank you. So the question is on why the doomsday clock is set so close to midnight and how that's helped the Bulletin advance its mission over the past, what will be in this coming year, the 75th anniversary of the doomsday clock. You mentioned former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry. He's the chairman of our board of sponsors, so you can feel his influence in where the clock is set. But we had been moving the clock steadily towards midnight since 1991, when we had moved it back to 17 minutes to midnight, and steadily moved it closer since then. And in the 90s, we're viewed as Cassandras, we're viewed as being out of touch with what was happening. But what we began to see soon after the Cold War and accelerated through the early 2000s and into the past 10 years or so was this brief moment of respite around nuclear security, a belief that finally, after all the work that had been done over the Cold War and the network of arms control agreements and the different kinds of political arrangements that were put into place, that we finally had a moment where we could say, if this wasn't over, at least it was getting better, at least we were reducing our arsenals, at least we had taken ourselves out of the cycle that an arms race puts countries into. But what we began to see is, as the public turned away, and rightfully so, as the public began looking elsewhere to other things to pay attention to, it took the pressure off the politicians. And so we see the direct link between public engagement and political change. We saw it immediately as soon as the public looked elsewhere and rightfully believed that they had done their jobs and would leave it to the experts to solve these problems for them. That kind of permissive environment began to look quite dangerous. So there's another factor that I won't talk about, but is important to the clock time, which is we do add climate and the climate reality in 2009 to the clock. And there's a whole story to be told in that, which I won't tell here. But if you focus even on the nuclear issue, what we saw was relations between the US and Russia deteriorate. The countries that control 90% of the world's nuclear arsenals, as that began to deteriorate and the walking away from arms control agreements and the investments in new weapons and advancement in weapons under the guise of modernization, we began to see the brakes on the disarmament efforts and the return of the skepticism and the return to the tit for tat of investments lead to investments, lead to investments. Fast forward to closer to where we are now and what we see today to lay the landscape for all of us. And my colleagues could give you the similar history as well. There's nothing secret about this, obviously, is you have the deterioration in US-Russian relations. You have other countries who are recognizing that and investing in their new nuclear arsenal, coming to a dynamic where every nuclear state is investing significantly in their nuclear arsenals, using the United States as an example, anywhere between 1.2 and 1.8 trillion dollars being invested in a new nuclear arsenal. What worries me the most in all of this, and I know we'll get to that, is you also see it in nuclear postures. You see it again using the United States, where I'm sitting, in its nuclear posture review of several years ago, a recognition of new areas in which the US would use nuclear weapons or might respond with a nuclear response. It's not just the United States that is building this into their postures. We see Russian military practicing as if a nuclear detonation was possible. We see it written into the Pakistani nuclear postures. We see how the North Koreans are testing. Every nuclear state is investing, and every nuclear state is acting as if the use of nuclear weapons is more rather than less likely. And that's the context in which former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry is responding. And so when we're asked the question, is it really this bad? Is it really what it was like during the Cold War? I'll just finish up this part of it, which is if you go back to 1953, when it was when we had moved it then to the closest it had ever been, when the US and the Soviets had tested hydrogen bombs. That danger, what the countries found themselves in was very little ability to communicate with each other, very little in terms of arms control arrangement, none really yet, very little in terms of all the confidence building measures and a kind of proliferation of materials around the globe. We're in a very similar position now, but we've torn down, it's worse. We've torn down what we've had in terms of that architecture, and new countries have been added with their own aspirations. And so we're very much in a similar, if not worse, position, along with all the new technologies that we cover, and as you mentioned, Lovely works on, added to the complications of how we understand it. So there are huge opportunities, and I'm sure we'll get to that, but it is a dangerous environment. So to answer the final part of your question is, how does this doomsday clock connect with the bulletin's work? One of the things we've been trying to do over the last few years is reconnect the two. This audience may know that the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist sets the doomsday clock, but for many, it's this announcement that gets made kind of in the ether, not connected to anything. So what we are trying to do now is, as we capture the world's attention, which the doomsday clock does each year when the time is announced, is to connect in a kind of, do you want to know more? Do you want to have the conversation about why? Why did we set it there? Should we talk about if we got this right? Is to connect it to the statement we put out every year, to connect it to other work going on in the field, to begin to create a route for people if they want to say, well, what do I do about this? Or what do I need to know to continue to connect and create a path from that announcement to a, hey, this is why it was set this way. Here's who said it. And do you agree? Why or why not? And do you want to get engaged? Here's how. That's what we're trying to build now. So it's not just put out there and people are stunned and then go about the rest of their day because it's not connected to anything.
Thank you, Rachel, for really giving us a sense of the overview of the stakes right now and why we are at 100 seconds to midnight. And just a quick question, when you're going to be releasing the 2022 Doomsday Clock announcement, if you know when that's going to be.
Yeah, we do. It's going to be at the end of January. So look for the exact date, the end of January of 2022. The Science and Security Board will come together in November. We'll do it virtually again this year. And then we'll work on the statement. They'll set the time, work on the statement, make sure the time and the statement connect, and then we will announce it. And then maybe just one sentence on, we announce it in January as an aspirational moment, if you will. We could, and it would make a whole lot of sense if we announced the time in December, right? The end of the calendar year, as everyone's trying to wrap up and think about what this year meant. But one of the reasons that I don't want to do it in December is because I don't want it to be a final chapter on a year that everyone says, oh yeah, that was bad, or oh, it's getting better, and turning to the new year. I think it's important that it's in January, that it gives us psychologically the whole year to try to turn it back. It's a challenge. It's a New Year's resolution of what we can do in January of 2022 to say, this is where the clock is. What can you do? What can we do? What can all of us do to continue to move the hands of the doomsday clock away from midnight? So end of January 2022.
Thank you, Rachel, and also for your commitment to public engagement and the way you're expanding that. It's so important. So now I'd like to go to a question for all of you. And Rachel, since it connects again to the doomsday clock in some way, I want to just an announcement. I want to continue with you. In 2020, let's see, Mary Robinson, former president of Ireland and chair of the elders, said at the 2020 Doomsday Clock announcement, as long as nuclear weapons remain in existence, it's inevitable that one day they will be used, whether by accident, miscalculation, or design. In light of Mary's statement, and with all that you know, which nuclear threat are you personally most concerned about? What keeps you awake at night? What has inspired you to work in journalism, to sound the alarm, to write, to publish, to purpose the power of story and art, to keep us awake to what's at stake? And finally, what's most personally challenging for you in this work?
Oh goodness, there's so much wrapped up in that question. I'll give a short answer so we can hear from others, because otherwise you and I could talk for the full 2 hours easily on that question. You know what? There's two things that keep me up at night, and they're related. And you know, you experienced the first directly. It's perfect that you're hosting this from Hawaii. It's the recognition that that misperception in wartime, during conflict, during uneasy relations, is what has led to so many of the world's most challenging conflicts. The moment where heated relations spiral suddenly out of control. And it's the misperception that in the false alert in Hawaii at a moment of high tension, some of the highest tension between the US and the North Koreans, at that moment, to have that experience could so easily have spiraled into something so much worse. As the Americans are figuring out how to signal with aircraft carriers, as and where to position them, and as tests are being tested, as nuclear weapons are being tested, and unsure of what homelands they can hit, to have that kind of alert and to easily play out how the North Koreans could have easily mistaken that for an American preparation for. It's in this moment of heightened tension, the misperception and the lack of confidence building measures. And I'm so delighted about the strategic dialogue, and I hope we'll hear more about that, because we need that to prevent misperceptions from spiraling, which connects very closely in my mind to this notion that every country is beginning to organize or is organizing as if nuclear weapons are usable. That is just what immediately takes us from the disentangling of an arms race right back into the centrifugal poles of arms races. If you believe that they are usable, you must invest in them. And we're just seeing that playing out in every country at every chance. And that pull is starting to feel very significant. And those are the two related issues that keep me up at night.
Thank you, Rachel, for bringing all of that to us and, reiterating the connection between the investments and the use and how they are taking us down a road that's just so dangerous. Elena, if you could respond to this question next, I'd be so grateful. Would love to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, and thank you one more time for the invitation to take part in this event. It's hard to add anything more to what Rachel has already said to this question. It's just I sleep very well at night. It doesn't keep me up at night. Luckily, as I said, I have two toddlers. They give me so much work over the day that I sleep well, but I worry about their future. Because what we are leaving to our children is a world that is more dangerous than the one that we have gotten from our parents, I think. And it's exactly what Rachel was talking about, these huge investments, the fact that weapons are becoming more and more usable, this idea of investing and already deploying new weapons where the threshold of using them is lower than before, the whole concept of low yield nuclear weapons. For a local conflict, which in my understanding doesn't really exist. I mean, a local nuclear war, it's a concept on paper. It's not the way that it would in a horror scenario look like in reality. So it makes me very nervous to look into the future because of the events that we are seeing today, of the growing confrontation between Russia and the Western countries, most of all the US. Yes, there is now since a few months that strategic security dialogue, and I'm also looking forward to hearing about concrete results that hopefully will be coming out of this. But at the same time, we see less and less direct communication between the two governments on other levels. For example, we have this deadlock on diplomatic missions, and that does influence the whole picture because there is not many communication channels that there used to exist before that. There is every few months there is more and more diplomats being sent out in reciprocity from one of the cities, and as Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov indicated in a comment yesterday to the media, there might be a moment where the diplomatic missions will be frozen altogether. So like no representation of the US here in Russia and no embassy of Russia in the US. And just imagine this happening and then relying for the two nuclear weapon states, the major weapon states, just relying on other communication channels. Okay, there is some, and luckily the military is still having regular connections and dialogue. But I think for a safer world, it's better to have as much connectivity as possible, as much representation as possible, because that lowers the risk of misunderstanding, misperceptions, and this growing distrust against each other. So what we see today in this relationship is very much worrying, of course, against the backdrop that these are the two most powerful nuclear states.
Thank you, Elena, for bringing in the diplomatic side, which is really, really in crisis, and that we have to decriminalize diplomacy. And that's something that has really suffered over these past years, particularly in the Trump administration. So, Elena, Katrina, I'd like to come next to you and invite you to respond.
It's been said, so much of importance. I begin, what keeps me up at night? It's the general kind of hyper-militarization of our foreign policy, the metastasizing proliferation of nuclear weapons. And at this moment, the US carriers and Chinese carriers in the South Sea, that is a new part of our landscape. And of course, what Elena, others have said about usable weapons, the barrier being lowered. I do think it's a moment to, as I've talked about, to rethink the entire concept of security. We haven't talked about COVID, but for years there was discussion of what would we do with these nukes if it was a pandemic? The nukes are useless. And what we've done is squandered so much of our resource, so many of our resources. That keeps me up at night too, the relentless greed of the military industrial congressional complex. I mean, the Bulletin had a very good story a few months ago about ICBMs, and sadly they've become the financing for infrastructure in parts of this country and how one breaks that tether. But it is a dangerous moment. Bill Hartung has done great work on this. Daniel Ellsberg has a piece in our latest issue of The Nation, just the profiteers, and why we are not looking at ending ICBMs, abolishing ICBMs, which many, including scientist Frank von Hippel, think counterproductive. What about what William Perry wrote so soberly about getting these nukes off of hair trigger, ending first use? These are simple, but not simple politically first steps. But I do think coming back to the security, what is security? Redefining that. And you asked what has influenced us. I mean, I've been going to Moscow, and I say Moscow because, that's where, but for 40 years. And I think it's a sense of what the first Cold War, because I do think we're at another Cold War now, we can discuss that. But the first Cold War did to empower the war parties in both countries and to reduce space for dissent, for speaking out, which we see today. And I think that doesn't permit a full dialogue, which we all seek. Totally agree with Elena. I mean, think the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was probably more dialogue and diplomatic possibility. Now it's at a low ebb, and it is dangerous if one seeks diplomacy and dialogue. I think we've lost the mindset of diplomacy. You mentioned decriminalizing. There has been a criminalization of a certain kind. I also, I don't think one has heroes as a journalist, but I have gotten to know over the years Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, and I think he was certainly one of the most radical thinkers about security and nuclear weapons ever to lead a nuclear country. And he has not wavered. He's 90, and he continues to talk about democratization, about security in the human terms. It is a wonderful irony that two Russians have won the Nobel Peace Prize in the last 30 or so years, and Dmitry Muratov is very close to Gorbachev. In fact, Gorbachev invested in Novaya, which, by the way, published Cynthia, our women's open letter on the eve of the last summit, the Biden-Putin summit, calling for much of what I talk about. I do think there's such energy in the climate crisis movement, and how we can fuse that is, to me, something to think hard about. I mean, there were 1 million people in Central Park in 1982 to lead to the abolition of an entire class of nuclear weapons. How do we retrieve that in a time of, it's true, we've talked about this apathy. So I think it may be that we continue to write. I think people are so busy with their lives. I'm just, think about Fukushima. That didn't really move the dial. I've heard people talk, and this is popular culture in a sense, people did talk about the Chernobyl series, and I think we need to think about popular culture in a way. My good friend Eric Schlosser has done this multimedia, The Bomb, based on his book, Command and Control. So I think we need to think creatively about that. But I completely agree with Elena that we are looking now at a nuclear, posture review that is moving away from counterterrorism, but to gin up a new Cold War with Russia and China. And that budgetary impact is so appalling at a time when people are asking, how do we provide, I won't even get into the numbers, but how do we provide healthcare? How do we provide vision and dental and childcare for our country? And the same in Russia. These are needs that, Novaya Gazeta and others have covered: poverty, pensioners. So I think there's a way to collaborate on some of that as we work toward demilitarizing and our foreign policy.
Katrina, thanks you so much for your, as always, bringing your eloquence, talking about the metastasizing proliferation of nuclear weapons, and unimaginably that we had more diplomacy during the Cuban Missile Crisis than we do today. And I just can't imagine if we were to enter some kind of crisis like that without the diplomatic architecture that Elena referenced. So thank you for all that. And lovely, I come to you now and would love for you to share.
Sure. Greetings, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So I'm just to situate myself, I'm actually tuning in from Los Angeles, California, which is the unceded territory of the Tongva people. And so hello from the West Coast of the United States. And again, I'm incredibly thankful to you, Cynthia, for gathering us together for this important conversation. So I'm not a trained journalist, but I appreciate the rigor and the pain and the thrill that comes with the discipline of writing. And I guess to tackle your questions, I just wanted to start off with the fact that the pandemic really illuminated a lot of things for me personally. And I'm still processing how it has changed me. But one of the earliest lessons it taught me is the value of my personal truth, even if that doesn't quite align with the expectations of others. And I say this because, quite honestly, I did not initially identify with the notion of nuclear weapons as a threat that keeps me up at night. And it is still hard sometimes for me. And I'd like to sort of unpack that a little bit. So at first, nuclear weapons was not presented to me as a personal threat, but almost like a personal fascination, because I was introduced to it as an academic exercise in college, the same way that I think many Gen Xers, millennials, and younger were sort of introduced to it for the first time, if at all. And the question that sort of fascinated me at that time was, why did countries pursue or not pursue nuclear weapons, which had a lot of cultural and historical intersections that attracted me as a scholar. But the point is, it was framed as a problem that can be explained and explored with a certain kind of distance and detachment. And it wasn't until I invested myself in it and actually pursued a career as a nuclear policy researcher that I realized the veracity of the problem, that there was in fact no distance at all. And upon closer sort of inspection or look, I realized that nuclear weapons really relies on this fragile web of human judgment, which we all already sort of talked about, right? That there have been several incidents where miscommunication and technological and human error have almost led us to a handful of nuclear crises, or that if you map out the history of the bomb, time and again, you see that decisions were made along the color line, and you can see which countries, which communities were sacrificed to gain what we now call as assets to national security. But as a society, I think we've grown so accustomed to living in a world full of nuclear weapons that it's been folded into our lives and sort of rendered invisible. So I guess to sort of answer your initial question, and I'm sorry that I'm going so slow, what scares me the most about nuclear weapons is our collective blindness to it, because I think we've already allowed so much harm to take place already without realizing it, that we've sort of allowed our hubris to control the technology. And I think that this hubris extends beyond nuclear weapons and can get into the core of the climate crisis and other urgent social issues. And so the question then becomes sort of, what will it take for us to get humble, especially in a society that incentivizes and rewards sort of bigger, faster, better, and winning at all costs, when what we really need to do sometimes is to slow down or stop. And so I want to be mindful of the time here, but I did want to try to tackle the second part of your question, which is why I write. Again, I'm not a journalist. I identify as a nuclear researcher and as a writer. And I write because sometimes the language we use in a nuclear weapons, or the language that we use to talk about nuclear weapons in the policy and scientific arena, is sort of insufficient sometimes to describe the veracity of the problem. What I did in my almost 10-year career as a nuclear policy researcher is such a privilege, and that not everyone has the time or resources to do what I was able to do and to gain that kind of level of understanding. So I, don't want to come from a place that insensitively tacks on nuclear weapons on top of like ordinary sort of urgent issues. But my creative expression, I would say, through writing and arts production, allows me to present parallels and make connections and pose questions that hopefully gets at that larger thing that I was talking about earlier, which is, how do we see despite our collective blindness? And one of my favorite artists, actually, his name is Teju Cole. He's a photographer and writer. He said something that really resonated with me, and this is quite a crude paraphrase. But he says, art sort of takes people to places that is quiet and to be able to concentrate in a moment. And I believe that my writing and arts practice really strives for this. Like, how can we create moments of quiet to examine the human condition, living under the shadow of the bomb in context of real, ordinary lives? And I guess the last thing I'll say is that, there are many forms of writing and storytelling, may it be sort of meditative essays or investigative, hard-hitting journalism, poetry. And I come from a place that believes that all of that is necessary to unpack sort of the complexities of our nuclear world. I think we should embrace sort of an information driven, but also culturally rich discipline that it is. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Lovely. Thank you for, again, your eloquence, talking about collective blindness, the hubris, the human condition, and your question, what would it take for us to be humble, and art taking people to places that are quiet, something for us all to really reflect on. My next question for you all is related to the role of journalism, coming back to that. What role can journalism play? What is the responsibility of the media to awaken and inform us about nuclear dangers, to advance nuclear risk reduction, arms control, disarmament, and global human security? And what do you think are the greatest barriers and challenges today in the way of achieving this? And so maybe Rachel, you could start again.
Sure. Thank you. So, you know, I think thinking about this question, and I think about it quite a bit. The Bulletin is just this funny organization, right? It was a magazine created by scientists. And so who are we, the experts, the media, journalism, how does it fit? But I think we sit at some of the crossroads of the challenges that the field is facing. So I do have some thoughts about it, which is media itself is in a moment of either crisis or great flux, dramatic change. What was in the past is different than what's going to be in the future. And I think in the media space, there's no silver bullet, for want of a better, of how to regain the space that it once had, right? In a sense, the monopoly on information, never quite that, but the ordered understanding of how to move an idea through different channels to connect with the public. And that's certainly oversimplifying what it ever was, but in comparison to where we're now with the proliferation of dissemination opportunities, anyone with a laptop can pretend to be an expert. It's just a very different environment. And so the first question for I think media organizations is how to survive and how to communicate. So and I think at the Bulletin, so first of all, there's something interesting happening that many of us on this call I think can benefit from and have a moment, is that non-for-profit news is having a kind of a sweet moment, a moment where the economic model of the media that is taking such a hit is very different in the non-for-profit space, and we see individuals contributing. And so I think that we have to take a moment and realize that the landscape is very, very different. Nobody has a path for how to move out of this. But people are looking for trusted sources. People are looking for, I call it a safe harbor, where they can trust the space that they're getting good information. And Katrina sits atop of one of the most respected in that space. We have a role to play in this. And so what we're trying to do is think very carefully. And I don't know if this is where you want to go, but I believe we're in a true battle of algorithms that we have to be really serious about. That some of my kind of predecessors back in the day had this view: if you just produce good work, people will find you. And I will say, I think that the bad guys out there have known all along that this is about getting to people's inboxes. This is being at the top where they're at. This is about showing up in their social media feeds with whatever nonsense they're producing and leaning in and investing there. And so where I believe we need to play at in me is to recognize that having good coverage is necessary but not sufficient. And I will say it is necessary but not sufficient, and that we have to be really thoughtful about how we get into people's inboxes, and what I would say on this, who want us to be there, right? So I don't even think at this point this is about changing minds. I mean, others might disagree with me. I don't think we've even saturated the market of those who want to hear from us. We haven't saturated the market of those who are receptive to our message. We haven't saturated the market of those who want to know more. And so listening to Lovely, right? Those who are coming up and get exposed to some of these issues and want to know where to turn, they don't know. And so we need to be in front of them. We need to be where on the platforms where they're at. Again, with good content, nothing happens without it, but really understanding this is a very different world, and understanding that, you know, these are conversations I have with my constituencies, like it's not good enough to be producing good work. So I think that, so first of all, like what's the media's responsibility? Like, we got to get in the game, you know, and the big players know this, and those on the panel know this, but we got to get in the game. And then how we do that, how we think about the user experience, those who are making, who our audience is and what they want and at what time do they want it. So how do we start with a compelling smaller message and begin to build that out? What do we do with the doomsday clock announcement? Again, to Lovely's point with the art, a board member had come to me very early on and had said, you know, Rachel, this is such difficult stuff that you're writing on, and there's no resting place, right? There's no place, in Lovely's words, to kind of sit and take it all in, that we need more than just text and prose. And then on the flip side, some people will come for that resting place to start with, but then may also get interested in the text and the prose. So being creative, as some of our predecessors were, about how we connect the visual, the arts, the analysis, that different people take in different information differently and wrap that around. That's something I think for media and journalism, everyone's thinking about, but we're thinking about that too. We are not separate from those trends. In fact, we're behind on many of them, and we need to make those investments if we want to be the kind of resource that we were, and I think people are asking us to be and are looking for.
Rachel, thank you for that incredible overview of the landscape today. So well expressed, and the importance of a trusted source, which I think people really want to know that they can rely on something in this time, because there's so much misinformation, and that you and Katrina and certain news organizations, Elena at Commerçant, are really trying to be that trusted source and getting in the game. Thank you for that. So Elena, would love to hear from you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I absolutely agree with Rachel. There has been this, a few years back, this wave of discussions if citizen journalism would just sweep away all professional journalism. And I think that this fear that we are talking about is one of the ones that is going to stay, no matter how many people access this area without like a professional experience before, just because it is so narrow and it needs some preparation, some knowledge. It's not easy to write about it, so you really need to be in this game to be able to give a good product. But you were asking also what the challenges were, and I think I see two challenges. One of them is access to information. It's of course an issue here in Russia because institutions are not happy to share the information that a journalist requires to write about all things nuclear. I'm talking, for example, about the Russian Ministry of Defense, which is very conservative when it comes to the media and communications approach. I'm very happy to be working most of all with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who is much more open to journalists and the people that work there on nuclear and security issues. They are so personally committed to their work, that they're happy to take a moment off their very busy schedule to explain things. I'm talking about, for example, Sergei Rabkov, when he was leaving the Geneva summit of the two presidents. He was like sitting on the plane already taking off, and that's exactly the moment where I called, and I appreciate it so much that there's diplomats like that on both sides. Like, he was taking up the phone, I could hear he was already taking off, but he still gave a comment about how important it was that the statement of the two presidents came out, that the nuclear war cannot be won and should not be fought, and all of this. You could hear that he was so exhausted from all the preparations of the summit, the whole summit and everything else afterwards, but he still took the time to explain the importance of this. But of course, he's a rare figure, and not everybody is like that. So getting to information is sometimes very challenging, but not only here in Russia. I must say that I was, for example, very negatively surprised by President Biden's appearance in Geneva after this crucial summit, after this very important statement on strategic stability. Not a single Russian journalist was invited to the press conference of the US president. While at Putin's presser, out of 19 questions, I think 7 were from American or Western journalism. And of course, they were not prepared. Nobody was putting them on some list or something like that. So this was just a normal press conference. And when it came to President Biden, and of course, the Russian journalists wanted to ask him about the same, the statement about the nuclear war, whether there's a chance that all of the P5 countries will maybe sign up to this and things like that. Not a single one was let in. So there's issues on both sides, and I think it's crucial that there is more openness to journalists that covers not only these issues, of course, but that is my point where it hurts. Another issue that Rachel already mentioned is getting this information over to an audience. Yes, because of that, trying to be that trusted source, I know that a special audience that is interested in these issues, they probably follow everything very closely, and they will read whatever, for example, we would write at Kommersant about this. But I think it's also very important to broaden this audience, get other people on board. And that's where, for example, stories like yours, Cynthia's, are very helpful, whereas a total different format, not the one that I write about, like 99%, that yesterday Vladimir Putin went to meet this and this guy, or yesterday Sergei Lavrov had this and this conversation. So there's this very personal, very alarming, very easy to read dynamic. So we had your piece that got lots of attention. There was a similar piece that I produced after a simulation exercise at the Munich Security Conference, where Global Zero, a few years ago, they organized this VR simulation where you could pretend to be the US president, and you would have 15 minutes to decide on whether you would bomb the country that allegedly started a nuclear attack against you, and that country was Russia. So I was surprised by the end to learn that out of like 30 something people that participated in this exercise, only me and another female colleague from India did not press the button and bomb Russia back. And we were presented, like, as a president of the US, you were presented with 3 options. I think the lowest option with using the smallest amount of nuclear weapons would result in like 5 million victims, and the greatest was 45 million victims, using the whole arsenal available to the US. So being Russian but also being put in this situation, I was not able to decide on any of the options. I was just sitting there in the end almost crying, because I mean, I had to take a decision. All these people were yelling at me at this virtual reality because I was the president of the US. And I just said, oh, I'm not going to do anything. I took these glasses off and I wrote about this, and this also got a lot of attention. So going out of this usual very dry, expert, serious format helps a lot. We see that very much. But most of the pieces are, of course, in a classical format. So there's challenges, but it's, I'm very helpful. I'm very, very thankful to my editor that they still give me the opportunity to write about pieces, even if they know in advance that it's not going to get much clicks and attention, like writing about the details of these conversations in the strategic security dialogue or other things that will get just, I don't know, few thousand readers, 1, 2, 3 or so, where you know that any photo gallery of Pippa Middleton's wedding would get 4 million clicks on Commerçant. And still my editor gives me the chance to reach that small audience, and I'm thankful to this.
Elena, that was an incredible inside view into what is going on for you that is rare for us to hear, and so grateful to you for sharing all of that. It really has gone in and is sitting with all of what you've said. It's very, very powerful. So thank you. Katrina, I'd like to come next to you.
So much important has been said. I wanted to pick up on what Rachel began with. The first centerfold in 1996 at the Nation was of corporate consolidation of the media. I think now we live, as you suggested, Rachel, with a kind of tyranny of the algorithm. We've sued Google in the last few months, joining with several media groups because they are predatory. And it's not just about the Nation, it's about a safe haven for independent media. So that may be a side note, but I do think, again, the airwaves are the people's airwaves, and the people we see talking about war and nuclear weapons are those Elena spoke of. They're the experts speak. There's the nuclear establishment. There's a reason there are these acronyms, so that, quote, ordinary people don't really they feel scared of entering a conversation which seems so distant from them. In addition, we don't see the destruction. I mean, we don't even see, the drone warfare, I think, has numbed people. And there's a video game quality, which is very dangerous in terms of trying to speak to people about war, destruction, finding an alternative, that war be the last resort. I'm thinking of mothers. I spoke, the mothers of Chechnya, the mothers of Plaza del Mayo. Mothers have played an important role in nuclear issues. And I think of the role they played in passage of Kennedy's 1963 nuclear test ban treaty. It was because a scientist found strontium in children's teeth that women got engaged. So I think there's a connection to lives lived that could play a role. I think of the militarization of our cities. There are connections being made, certainly after 9/11, when military equipment was being brought into cities that was also being used abroad. There's something in there. There's the corruption of our media. I think of Politico. I don't know if you know, Elena, the Politico newsletter is sponsored by Northrop Grumman, a defense company. So you wonder how fair that newsletter is going to be. We talked about speaking truth to power. Those in power, I talked once to Daniel Ellsberg about this, those in power know the truth. And so it's more about what I think Rachel and Elena spoke of, the strategic thinking about getting what we are reporting to people and to bypass some of the gatekeepers. And I think we're in a moment where we could do that with creativity. I think Lovely spoke about other forms. Could be music, could be, poetry, it could be different kinds of storytelling. But I think there is an ability, even with the saturation and the difficulty of getting people's attention, to think harder about that. I think Lovely spoke, or the triumphalism which afflicts us. I'm not sure, it's hubris, it's triumphalism, it's arrogance. And I think humility and restraint are something that would appeal to many who I don't think feel so engaged as the elite in going abroad and lecturing and maybe getting our own house in order, doing some nation building at home without isolationism. I think an internationalism is very important. I think, some getting younger writers, I'm not going to be ageist. I've worked with someone, Jonathan Schell was one of the most brilliant writers about abolition. Ray Atchison has a book out about Ban the Bomb. Beatrice Finn, these are extraordinary people who have a following. And I think we've been talking about Russia and the United States, but I think in the world, you see it in the United Nations, the global ban. There is more kind of action and activity, which we could link to. So I think I will say one thing, part of the dynamism, horrible, it's not the right word, of the Cold War in the 50s and 60s was fear. And fear is a motivating force sometimes to gather attention. The day after, people remember the day after, was on ABC for 3 hours in 1983. It had more viewers than a Super Bowl. But it was very powerful in showing the destruction of a nuclear weapon. But it was about fear, which moved people. And I think we need to have fear and hope somewhere in that mix. So there are a lot of questions, but the fact that we're talking about these is so important, because it leads to, leads to social movements, it leads to activism. I see it in the chat, people want to know more. It's not going to be, as you said, Rachel, silver bullet I've stopped using, but it's not going to be in one day. It's going to take some time if we have time, but I think it's going to take a lot of our work to move thought, narrative, thinking, action.
Thank you, Katrina. Again, your words, the tyranny of the algorithm, finding a safe haven for independent media and information, and connecting to lives that are lived, and the role of women, all of it, humility and restraint. Thank you. Lovely.
Sure, I'll be very quick here. So for me, I think the role of journalism really boils down to showing or shedding light or revealing sort of what are often obscured power dynamics. And I think that also translates to the topic of conversation today, which is nuclear weapons. And what is particularly striking to me is that, sometimes, institutional order isn't born out of malice. Sometimes it's just the routine way of doing things, or patterns that we just follow because we've assumed that that's sort of the right course of action. And I think journalism can be that sort of way of disrupting that and questioning whether those sort of dynamics that we hold true, the power dynamics that we hold true, should be preserved, or if we should continue pursuing that path. And I mean, at this point, I agree with what everyone's already said. And I guess the one thing that really came up for me listening to the other panelists is this idea of an independent sort of media as it tries to grapple with the tyranny of algorithms. And one thing that that continued to come up for me is like, what does it mean for us to champion local, like hyper local journalism? And maybe this goes back to Katrina's point of like, not everything, although internationalism is really important, there are like pockets of, at least speaking for the United States, of communities that I think are untapped because we haven't really cultivated sort of local reporting at that level that can really connect to what they hold as important within those communities. And I just be curious to see how we can use that almost as a leverage in order to sort of offset a lot of what we're feeling right now, which is an inundation of just random content. And again, being controlled as to like what we see, and it's beginning to lose that sense of community. So I wonder if there's ways that we can encourage and really save local journalism, and just thinking about what that looks like in context of what we've been speaking about in terms. And I know that past several years, there's been a lot of great reporting about nuclear weapons production facilities and the ways in which they've harmed frontline communities. And I think that on top of the larger geopolitical conversations we've been having between like tensions among US, Russia, China, being able to balance that out to something that is more grounded to what's happening in sort of our local homes. I think that's really important to have both.
Thank you, Lovely, for bringing that local connection in and the importance of those stories of people being affected, and talking about shedding light and the concept of the inundation of random, dealing with the inundation of random content. All of that is really food for deep thought. So our next question, some of you have already addressed, so maybe we could briefly address this next question, which is what it's going to take, where are the opportunities, the points of entry to engaging more journalists, the media, and public on nuclear dangers and awakening them to action. How do you personally work to achieve this? How can redefining security for the 21st century and the intersectionality of nuclear weapons with just about every other urgent issue of our time serve as points of entry? So maybe just some further thoughts on what you've already shared that address some of these points. And we can start again with you, Rachel.
I think there are several points of entry, although we still have so much work to do, and how do we keep it from becoming technical? The bulletins issue, the September issue, talks about military spending in a time of COVID and climate change, and Katrina referenced it. It is absolutely ludicrous that we are having this conversation about increased military spending when we're in our homes because of COVID, with the numbers worldwide it has killed and sickened. I mean, it is so incomprehensible that we are not throwing everything we have at managing globally this global challenge that we know we will experience again, either because humans are encroaching increasingly on their environment, or because labs that are testing these, importantly testing viruses, are not regulated well. I mean, it's laid out for us, and we are in our homes because of it, and yet we are spending this money. So our current issue tries to look at this and really get at these numbers about, even if you acknowledge that resources need to be put in at this moment to ensure that the existing nuclear weapons are safe and secure and aren't subject to accidents, right? There's still, on top of that, significant amount of resources that are going into a new nuclear arsenal. It is incomprehensible. I think there's the trade-offs between what's needed for climate and what's needed for current pandemics, and yet we're spending upwards in the US alone of 1.8 trillion. It can and should be a point of conversation. And then just also given what's going on in our environment. So this is from the United States, but I was sitting in this home in May of 2020, right after the murder of George Floyd. That was a moment that really brought together the injustices around race in the United States and the consequences that happened. As a march was going by my house with my kids in the house saying, literally going by the house, can we go? In the midst of a pandemic. Like, if that wasn't a wake-up call to say, like, this is their lives and our neighbors' lives, and they are not safe. They are not made safer by our investment in nuclear weapons. Right? Literally in one day in May, it's so obvious in this household, right? So I think really articulating and coming to terms with these trade-offs, that we all have a stake. We are all being made less safe by these investments, and they're budgetary. They are the power of the purse. And ongoing debates, do people get motivated by the power of the purse? That's what has brought people out in the past. Is our money being used well? Our national treasure. It is not making us safer. And so going back to what Katrina was saying, and that I believe we are investing in a 20th century. We are making 20th century investments for a 21st century reality, and we will all be poorer for it and less secure. That's how I think this conversation has to change. And investments may be needed to be made, and there's, it's a multipolar world, and all of that, and we need I believe deeply we need new big thinking around strategy in the 21st century and what that means, but none of that is happening. And so because we're lazy and uncreative, we are making these 20th century investments, and it will not make us safer. So I think if we can continue to get our head around what that means and where to pressure political leaders to make investments, it's so obvious. The planet is literally presenting us with other options, and we're just too lazy and uncreative to kind of follow a new path.
Rachel, I just want to say thank you for all of that. And, your phrase, we're making 20th century investments for a 21st century environment. We're all poorer and less safe, I think is something that we all need to sit with. And in light of something that coming up in Congress to decrease the defense budget a couple of times by 10% in the midst of a pandemic, and we get bipartisan consensus right away on not cutting it. So there's something to be said for connecting what you've said about people and who's getting elected, and how they're spending the money that is our treasure, as you said. Thank you. Elena, I'd like to come to you. How does it look from Russia?
I maybe like to comment on the point of where we can get more like people to write about these things and more journalists covering this area. I thought it was very helpful for me about 10 years ago when I went through a crash course on strategic security issues at the Peer Center here in Russia that organized an international summer school for 2 weeks, where there was young diplomats, young politicians, experts, and journalists. And for 2 weeks from 8 a.m. until very late in the evening, we had lectures from Russia, but also from Western countries, European countries, who were teaching us about nuclear security issues, arms control, all things non-proliferation, chemical, biological security. So it was a crash course that I would never have gotten at any other place, or maybe for years. It helped me very, very much being more precise in my reporting, having much more background, understanding things. And then over the years, I understood that there is, for example, nothing like this specific for journalists, just for journalists who are writing about security issues that are connected with arms control and non-proliferation. There was a discussion to make some seminar or something like that at a meeting of US and Russia experts just before the pandemic started. It was organized by Bill Potter and Vladimir Orlov. And we met in Washington. There was American colleagues, Russian colleagues, that they were thinking about doing something maybe together for Russian and US media, maybe inviting also representatives of other countries that are specifically writing about things and like kind of upgrading their knowledge, giving them more background, bringing new people in. So we would have more professional authors writing about this, that they would know where to get the expertise, which experts to ask, which topics to follow, and so on. This never materialized very much because of the pandemic and all of that, but I think it's still good to think about projects that would be helpful for journalists to upgrade their knowledge and maybe get people to write about the things that haven't done this before in all of the different countries. Yeah.
That's a wonderful suggestion. It's really democratizing also the space and bringing more people in and really providing the real trusted source kind of information that Rachel has referred to. So thank you for that. And we see it in you. So it's great. Lovely. I'd love to hear from you.
Sure. I totally agree with this idea of demystifying nuclear security issues in order to encourage new writers to come on board and tell really compelling stories about it. The other thing that came to mind is just being careful about the language that we use. Very recently, I've been seeing sort of the phrase new Cold War sort of tossed around, right? With the ways in which we describe the friction between Russia or even really China. And I wonder, to what extent as we echo that language, because I do believe that in some ways language can act as a container that could possibly subconsciously restrict our perspective. And that's the reason why journalists and writers, I think, have a responsibility, because once we continue to sort of echo those possibilities, it's like, we're going to repeat what we've done in the past, and these are the only options that we have. I think that can be a very dangerous territory. And so I'd be very curious also to think about the opportunities to question, like, what is the other choice beyond what we've observed as patterns of our history? How can we break from that? And I wonder if new writers, especially from younger generations, can be more illuminating, as they sort of see what's sort of going on in our current sort of security condition. And I'll stop there to let others respond.
I just wanted to say I love that point, because I think there may be a self-replicating quality to using the Cold War, and how we describe the world we're in now should be different in ways and taking into account. But at the same time, there's sort of patterns that are happening. I mean, I'm thinking, I don't know if people saw, there was this woman who is a deputy assistant secretary of defense for nuclear and missile defense, who was pushed out, removed. This was September 22. And,
we reported about this even here in Russia.
Is that right? Yeah, people wonder why we, don't learn from failures like Vietnam or Iraq, Afghanistan. And people who point out alternatives to current national security policies are often driven out of positions of authority. And I think that is, there's not much room for alternative thinking inside the power structures. And you see it reflected in the money piece. I mean, Biden's doubled down on, quote, modernization of the nuclear arsenal. And if we're not in a new arms race, let's think of what we can describe it as. I was struck to speak about Bill Burton, who really does the best work on kind of profiteers. Some of it is simply the money. I mean, not in the way Rachel spoke of, which is, but the other side of the money is the lobbying. Do you know there are more lobbyists? There are almost as many lobbyists for the defense companies as there are representatives and senators, 380 or 400. And the money that's sluicing through the system. I do think we need to be sensitive, and I think this is the case in Russia too. Your ICBM piece in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, a superb article a few months ago, showed that these companies like Brunham will claim that they're building the infrastructure and creating the jobs in communities. There's something to it, but there's such a waste of this money because you could invest in different kinds of jobs. But the problem is America was kind of created around this military Keynesianism, and we need to rethink that. And there's a concept called just transition, which speaks to both people in the defense industry, but also like coal miners. The jobs are dwindling, but it's still people's jobs. And I'm sure it's an issue in Russia where you have an older infrastructure, a lot of factory towns, you still very powerful. And I you said, Elena, if I could, about the difference between the state, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Defense Ministry, and how you spoke of people who are good diplomats inside the foreign ministry, and how the Geneva summit broke down for Russian American journalists. You say that on Rachel Maddow, you will be demonized from here to Paducah. Sorry, I won't get going on. No, really, I mean, there is on TV a little bit still of the legacy of Russiagate, which may have had some truth to it, but I think this country wasted 3 or 4 years without exploring its own pathologies, blaming Russia, demonizing Russia. And what we failed to do is learn much about Russia in that time, because it was all Putin. It's all Putin. And now we need to rebuild, I think, our dialogue. And I think one of the most exciting things is your suggestion about teaching the Potter-Orloff model for younger journalists, just journalists who want to know evidence-based, fact-based journalism around these very hot issues. Sorry for my rant.
Katrina and Lovely, thank you for all of your suggestions on the just transition. Lovely, you're talking about the importance of choice of words. Katrina bringing in the lobbying and the patterns that are resurfacing. All of it's really important as we explore this issue. Moving to the next question, we have this rare opportunity today of having Katrina and Elena with us, who represent, who have been really involved in US-Russia relations, and Katrina, US-Soviet, going back to the Cold War, to really to ask you some questions about that you've touched a little bit on already, so we'll be mindful of time, but the costs of not cooperating, the costs of being in this situation where there's such demonization, unacceptably high tensions, how that interfaces with the risk on nuclear weapons. We've touched a bit on that. But what is the impact both on the potential for an incident that would be a confrontation, but also for progress on reducing our arsenals? And so I'm going to combine this and, with the next question, just in the interest of time, but asking you both to then really move to imagine, what it would take to get the United States and Russia back to the existential business at hand of reducing our arsenals. We really need massive cuts, especially in light of, the mandate in Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty to end the arms race and to achieve total disarmament. And especially considering that other countries, especially with China in mind, they've said they will not consider reductions until the US and Russia come down to their level. So just, what would the conditions be? What would need to happen in the media, among the people, governments, et cetera? I know it's a big question, but if you could kind of combine those together and knowing that you've touched on a few things already, I'd be really grateful to hear your thoughts about the pathway forward and what it would take. I think it's really important because we have 90% of the world's nuclear weapons, as a number of you have already said, Rachel and others. So welcome you. And I welcome either one of you to go first, whoever wants to go first.
Elena, she's the nuclear expert. I'm just
I'm not an expert. I'm a watcher. I just watch this, and I sometimes feel more as a historian writing this all down. Cynthia, I have asked very important questions, but realistically said, I don't think that media or expert communities can do anything much to really influence the decision of governments to go into further cuts, at least not here in Russia, because decisions are being made on the top of the government. And it might be different than the US, but the influence here of the civil society on government decisions is very limited. But I think it's possible on governmental level to, if not achieve further cuts in the coming years, which I think is rather unrealistic, but maybe agree on some confidence building measures in all of the areas that are being discussed now within the strategic security dialogue. May it be strategic weapons, non-strategic weapons, offensive, defensive, cybersecurity in its strategic aspect, space security, all of these issues. Maybe some agreements can be achieved there that will at least make this space a bit safer, not going into further cuts and reductions, but agreeing on some more information sharing, verification, more limits on behavior, some rules of the game. For example, in cyber, there's no rules at all. So some agreements here are achievable, I think. And you said, of course, Russia and the US, they have 90% of the arsenal. And you mentioned China, who said they're not going to join the discussions unless the two countries go down. But China is, as far as we can watch, probably quite fast building up their own arsenal. And Russia, as was saying, is that they won't push, even try to push China into the talks unless the other nuclear states also begin to be expressing their willingness to talk. And this is, of course, about France and the UK. Yes, they might not have much, but they have some. I mean, it's nuclear weapons. You don't need many of them to start a nuclear war, destroy another country. So I think it's important that we get communities and experts and journalists also from these countries in. And in difference to Russia, I think civil society has more to say in these countries. And there hasn't been much of a civil society outrage or reaction or alarmist voices about, for example, the decision of the UK to start building up their nuclear arsenal all of a sudden. I think that is something that is missing here. So we are talking about not only the two major countries, but also other official nuclear weapon states, but non-official as well. India, Pakistan. I mean, okay, we're not talking North Korea, that's unrealistic, but Israel. Getting also them on board. I think that matters. If not getting to further cuts, but at least making this a bit safer.
Elena's so cogent in this, but I think we can't give up on the idea of reductions. You know, in 2002, John Bolton, he worked for George W. Bush. They began to roll back the piece of the arms control regime. You know that, the anti-ballistic missile treaty. And then it began to keep going. And I think that was already such a low point in the sense that we were already in real nuclear danger. I think leadership matters, and I may be wrong. I personally think social movements are imperative, allied with leaders who understand the risks and the dangers and the challenges. I may be stuck on Gorbachev, but I think you would not have seen the changes we saw if you didn't have in Reagan a curiosity, because he was quite militant in other areas, militaristic, but he saw his future as working, takes two to tango, to work with Gorbachev to reduce the nuclear arsenals. They could have gone further, of course. Gorbachev was ousted, Reagan left the White House. I do agree that cybersecurity, I don't know if you followed it, Elena, I'm sure you have, but in this country, there's often a hyping about cybersecurity, so it becomes cyber war. Cyber war has been compared to a new Pearl Harbor. If it's Pearl Harbor, what does that mean in terms of response? And I think that would be area for treaty, some kind of dialogue, confidence building now, before it moves to such a stage where one can't touch it. I see that the Rotary International is considering a resolution to take a stand for a nuclear-free world. I mean, you get some of the Rotarians. We used to remember the Nobel Peace Prize went to Physicians for Social Responsibility. Build out communities, I think, as Lovely said in a different way, build out communities in this country which have a stake in different ways. But I do think sometimes people don't think they can make a difference because it's so distant. But like with the climate, one of our student nation recipients led the divestment movement at her university. It's divest and reinvest. If that could be underway, as I think it is in some countries here, people might feel more connected to some act they could take, which is the beginning of social organizing. But Elena knows the technicalities in a much more professional way, which is why this course should be built out. But I can't sit here and say we should let reductions go by. It just makes no sense. And I think to people, as Rachel spoke of, in this COVID, not post-COVID, but in this COVID time, the waste of resources is one of the parts that has to move people to think about how we could be a different country. And that's my thinking.
I just want to thank both of you for how you have addressed this. Elena, with your very specific, practical steps, we got the reaffirmation of the Declaration of a Nuclear War cannot be won and must never be fought as a first step. How can we build out from there? And you've outlined some very significant ways and practical ways we can get to the possibility of reductions, I think. And also the importance of bringing in engaging all the other countries who will talk about this and who are ready to do it. And Katrina, I also feel that we cannot let go of the aspiration of reductions. And, here, one of the indigenous pieces of wisdom I've learned is if you can't see it, if you don't visualize it, if you don't hold that vision, it's not going to happen. You have to be able to see it. You have to be able to hold that possibility. And you spoke about leadership and the head of Rotary.
Yeah.
The new head, I believe his name is Mehta, his last name, is leading this in many ways. And I think the importance of leadership in all areas is going to be, and you mentioned Gorbachev, of course, is a factor.
And the doctors and
the
nurses.
community. Yes, so I feel like, and especially just mentioning the TPNW, which 122 countries adopted at the UN and 56 have now ratified, and many of them are from the global South. And, really most of the world is being held hostage by the nuclear armed states. And we get into the issues of radioactive racism and nuclear colonialism, and the world is moving in a different direction. So aspirationally, yes. Lovely. We now come to you. And I am so excited for you to share with us your work. And I just want to say that for people, especially those who are joining us late, a few years into your career as a nuclear policy expert, you repurposed your expertise as a gift to be shared and embarked on a path-breaking journey as an artist to engage the public at Bomb Shelter, a portal for using the language and visuals of the arts to inspire a different way of seeing, understanding our relationship to nuclear weapons, weaving your expertise with human experience and emotion, making our relationship to the bomb present, palpable, and personal, forging an emotional connection that holds us accountable as humans in the service of making nuclear weapons matter and giving voice and agency to all, especially those most deeply affected. You ask, what does it take to have a critical mass of people care again, short of a nuclear attack or disaster? And you answer, I believe it's a matter of reclaiming our imagination. So I invite you now to share some of the extraordinary ways you're using the blessed gift of your words and visual expressions to help us reclaim our imagination and transform our nuclear legacy. Welcome.
Well, thank you for that again. I'm just so honored to be described in that way. But before I turn to some of my work, I did want to share a few more inspirations to emphasize the point that I made earlier, that there is a wide range of writing and arts practice that can help us think about nuclear issues. You know, we just listened to Elena and Katrina talk about it from their like journalistic, that information-driven standpoint. And now, you know, I'd like to take you for a few minutes into like more of a literary plane. So bear with me. I'm going to share my screen, and I only have a few slides here. Okay. I hope you can see this. Okay, great. Well, Cynthia, you encouraged me to share Neruda's poem. And I don't know if you can see, it's just, oh, there you go. So you encouraged me in our email exchange to share Neruda's poem. So I will very briefly. So Pablo Neruda was a Chilean poet, diplomat, senator, exile, whose writing and artistry coexisted with his politics, which I think is incredibly fascinating. And he wrote this poem, Ode to the Atom, and I think it's one of the most compelling commentaries on peaceful uses of the atom. And I encourage you to read the whole thing, because chopping it up the way I'm doing here, it really just doesn't do it justice. But I did want to share these few lines, and I'll read them very quickly here. They trained you, atom, to wipe out nations, to turn love into a blackened sore, to burn down piles of hearts and annihilate the blood. Oh, you insane spark, go back to your shroud, bury yourself in your mineral sheets, be a blind pebble again. And perhaps I'm a bit biased because my expertise in the field is nuclear nonproliferation. So it's the policies and the systems that prevent governments from taking legitimate and responsible use of nuclear material for weapons development. But what I really find compelling about Neruda's poem is that it actually encapsulates the story of nonproliferation. You know, he uses the words trained and enlisted. In another part of the poem, he uses the word enlisted, the atom. And it sort of questions whether it's possible for the atom to return to the shroud as it was. And what I really love about this piece of writing is that it reminds me why I do what I do. Oftentimes, you know, on a day-to-day, I read policy memos, research reports about nonproliferation, and I think it's just such a gift to see a non-nuclear expert, albeit he was a politician back in the day, but someone who is able to grasp the complexity of the atom in this way. And I think that it just enriches the textures of this nuclear world. And that's why sometimes, even as a nuclear researcher, I go to poetry to remind me of sort of the philosophical underpinnings of why we do well. And then I wanted to also share Ross Gay, who writes about everything. He's a poet. But I came across this short essay he wrote in this book, The Book of Delights. And the piece is called Hole in the Head. I'm not going to read it because of time, but I highly recommend that you seek out this book and his essay, because it goes into a very shocking place about Vertus Hardiman and the radiation experiments in the 1920s here in the United States. And I read this piece when it came out, or when the book came out in 2019. And I had to say that I was ashamed that I did not know who Versus Hardiman was until I came across this. And I think it really ties back beautifully to Neruda's sort of philosophical question of what have we trained the atom to do? And is it possible to sort of undo or unsee its blackened sore? Because of the way that we traditionally study nuclear weapons, these kinds of peripheries are sometimes not included in our knowledge, training, or education. And so sometimes I have to look at outside literature to continue to discover things about my own field. And so I'll just briefly share with you two works that I started to with a few of my artist collaborators. And to Cynthia's introduction earlier, these projects sort of helped me reclaim my imagination during this global crisis. And this piece that you're looking at now is called Bloom, which is sort of a prototype book who I worked with a bookmaker in New York. Her name is Tammy Nguyen, and she's actually also a painter. You could see some of her paintings in right now of the Greater New York Art Exhibition, which is quite a distinction in New York City. But I've been collaborating with her on this project called Bloom, which sort of encourages us to think about survival, not only in the context of human existence, but really in an interspecies way. And it is inspired by the work of activists and specifically hibakushas that have looked to the survival of fauna and nuclear bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so this is sort of my way of expanding my research to include, when we talk about saving and security, how can we incorporate other living entities into that sort of framing? I was planning to read an excerpt, but I don't think we have the time. So I'm just going to show you visuals. But again, there's only like a handful of these books because we worked on it last year and experimenting with its organic growth, in that a lot of the writings are still in draft form. But the idea, especially now, hopefully that we can be out and about with vaccines and be able to responsibly meet, is actually introduce some of the writing and the research in this book into gardening workshops, specifically for younger folks in low-income communities, to introduce them to the idea of survival and regeneration in context of our nuclear history. And this first installation of Bloom, we talk about the ginkgo tree that survived primarily in Nagasaki and sort of the stories around that. And I guess more relevant to some of the conversations we've been having during this hour is sort of the sunflower diplomacy between the US and the Soviet Union. I'm sure some of the crowd here knows that there was a point in which the United States, through the cooperative threat reduction project or initiative under Secretary Bill Perry, they had this like public gesture alongside Russia and Ukraine to plant sunflowers in a decommissioned silo in Ukraine. And again, it's one of the most remarkable gestures of arms control. And I think I wanted to look at it or look at this particularly point of nuclear history, not as a nuclear researcher, but as a storyteller, and get a sense of what it was like for those diplomats to come to an agreement and still at the preliminary sort of research and interview phase. But I've already sort of just started to learn a little bit more about what it was like that initially they thought that they were going to plant wheat, but they've decided to go with sunflowers. And one of the diplomats who I talked about mentioned that really this is a story of the art of the possible at that time. You know, how can we be creative with diplomacy itself? And I think a lot of people don't really think that. And to Katrina's point earlier about finding patterns, I mean, there's patterns in failures, but there's also patterns in some of the successes. And oftentimes we forget the small wins and the small successes in, you know, this long arc of our nuclear history. And I'd be really curious to sort of ignite, or I would like to ignite that curiosity in sort of the younger generation of what does arms control diplomacy look like in the future. And then I guess the last project that I'll show, if operates, to this point about reclaiming imagination, I think my artistic process also helped me reclaim my imagination with regards to what it's like to work as a nuclear expert. Earlier this year, I had the opportunity to get to know a few Marshallese youth who live in Arkansas. A lot of people don't know that Springdale, Arkansas is the largest Marshallese ethnic enclave in the United States. And through called Reverse the Truth, was able to, through Zoom, get to know a few Marshallese youth who were essentially reckoning with this idea of nuclear legacy and what does it mean for them to address that, even though they are no longer in their sort of motherland or home, island home, because they're in landlocked Arkansas. And the way that I had to process that history, I couldn't enter that space with sort of the research reports and memos that I'm used to. Like, we essentially poetry is work together. And there was obviously a difference in our backgrounds, difference in age, difference in knowledge base around nuclear issues, but art really helped become sort of that glue for us to get to know each other. And we worked on this poem together, which is now published in Outrider Post. And I was fortunate enough to be able to edit it for them. And now these young writers can say that they're published poets, which I think is high school or early, undergrad, college. And then now we are working with an animator, Catherine Killow, who actually is also a nuclear policy expert that looks into issues in the Koreas, but she's also an incredibly gifted artist. And so we're working with her to animate this poem. And so I think, we found a very creative way to come together during the pandemic and feel a sense of community when there are really a lot of ways to do that. And I guess I'll end by just saying that, most citizens in the world, because they're not privy to a lot of information that we know, the first step is to really recognize that they can be a part of the conversation, that they have every right to a level of nuclear awareness and education that has been framed as inaccessible and too technical, hence our collective blindness. And for me, that becomes an act of translating that makes my nuclear career fulfilling. And I didn't mean to rhyme that, but anyway, I thank you guys for looking at some of these images, and hopefully that's a good summary of the work that I do.
Lovely. Thank you so much for sharing some of the really extraordinary ways you address making this work accessible to people of all ages from all communities, and you bring forth the voices of those most affected who are often not in the conversation and need to be in the conversation. And your sunflower diplomacy, which is that was so inspiring to me, your interspecies survival and regeneration, that all of those projects, I'm so looking forward to how they unfold. So thank you so much for sharing all of that in the really very moving poem by Neruda that is still inside of me. Really appreciate it. So we're coming to the end, and I'm just going to quickly ask for closing remarks if people have time. I know it's getting to the end, but I just wanted to ask you the final question, because we've touched on the other questions largely, which may be a very short answer to, what brings you the greatest hope and joy in your work? And as we approach the UN Week for Disarmament, what is your prayer and what is in your heart? Maybe just a very quick response to that, and then we'll do a closing blessing with Puna and announcement of our next session. Whoever wants to go first.
I just wanted to say that I'm so moved and inspired by Lovely's work, and to see Pablo Neruda and Ross Gay. My mother had a literary foundation, and we worked with Ross Gay. He's extraordinary, his latest book of poetry as well. And I think what you do is to reclaim the imagination and find other ways of expressing is so critical to bring people into a conversation that has to be opened up. So thank you. And I won't say I'm going to Google because we're suing them. I'm going to go check it out to find out more about your work and your experiences.
I'll add a few quick words. Thank you very much for this panel. What makes me hopeful is events like this where you meet people of high sanity. I don't know how to say it in English, but zdravый смысл, so a sober mind, which makes one optimistic in this absolutely crazy world. Thank you so much.
Cynthia, I think you're on mute now.
Rachel, I was just saying, Rachel or Lovely or Katrina, any final closing remarks? What's in your heart?
I would just join in on what's been said. And I think Lovely really plays the path for us for moving forward, and creates a way of speaking about these issues that I think are more resonant in 2021, soon to be 2022, or it has the resonance, that we're seeking and looking for. And I just have a lot of time to listen to how she talks about these issues, and that's what gives me hope. And I would just end on this one piece, which is I keep hearing from my generation and older, which is like, youth today don't get it. And it's so wrong. They do. The youth today are confronted by existential threats in a way that and a variety of them in a way that we haven't had to experience. What they're looking for, desperate for, searching for is how to respond, how to make sense of it, how to respond, what can they do. And they're very engaged when they feel that their time is worth their effort, and because they have a lot of choices, unfortunately, to choose from. So I think we see the effects of the power of the people in the streets around the climate issue, and and how it's moving the political debate. And I think we should take great heart in that. And I think we should watch that and listen to what Lovely and her colleagues and peers are telling us. And I think that is really kind of laying the steps and the path for moving forward. So I will I will take my hope from that and this conversation of allowing us to experience it. So Cynthia, thank you for that.
Thank you, Rachel. Really, really touched. Katrina or Lovely, do you have closing words you'd like to share?
No, I've just, it's really difficult to find very heartwarming and inspiring virtual spaces nowadays as we continue to do this for almost 2 years. So I'm just really excited to be part of this. So thank you.
Thank you for being here. Really, really inspired by your presentation.
I'm just moved by the Nobel Peace Prize recipients too, Maria Ressa and Dmitry Muratov, and journalism and what it can do to bring about peace and understanding. And that was an exciting moment last week.
Thank you, Katrina, ending on that really beautiful, hopeful note. And I just want to, we're going to have Auntie Puna share a closing blessing with us in a moment. I just want to make a few announcements. First, you can learn more about our mentors, speakers today, and more about their writing and their work on our mentor page on our website and our mentor resource page that we're putting into the chat right now. Lots of incredible information that I've gone through and we've been so inspired by. So they're doing such great work. And I also just want to invite you all next week to our session on the 20th, Wednesday, the 20th, a week from today at the same time, which is going to be on ceremony and a treaty to transform our nuclear legacy. And we have with us again, Ambassador Elaine White Gomez, who negotiated the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. We have Marian Naranjo of Pueblo Hope United, whose ancestral lands, Los Alamos is inside of the ancestral lands, and she works on environmental and health issues for her community around what's happened at Los Alamos and is still going on today. Susie Snyder, who oversees the divestment campaign for ICANN and Don't Bank on the Bomb. And then, of course, as I mentioned, then Shannon Biggs, who's the founder of Movement Rights, who works on the rights of Indigenous peoples, and especially with respect to the rights of nature, implementing the rights of nature. It's going to be a great program. So that link, registration link, is going to the chat. And I just want to thank you, all of you mentors. You've been absolutely extraordinary, and it's been such a gift to have you with us this morning. This kind of conversation is so meaningful and touches my heart, as Lovely said, to echo your words. And for all of you who have joined us from many time zones around the world, thank you for caring. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being here. Please take this work out and share it with your friends and communities. And thank you to Tom for your session tech management. And now, Auntie Puna, I'd love to welcome you to share a closing blessing as we close the circle. And thanks for everyone's patience going a little over time. Welcome, Auntie.
Ano ai ko ala hele. I'm so honored to be witness to not just hear, but see the expression of love, faith, and hope in the work that all of you do. It is such a joy to know that there are people like all of you that care, that are true mothers of all that is. And the work of your hands, the work of your heart, the work in Indigenous thought that continues to come every time we have a session. You have the power of the word in the things that you share. When I say ano ai ko ala hele, we are all created the moment of our conception, and that is the light that we all have and own as individuals. In Hawaiian thought, when we say love and light, aloha and ike, we're saying to everyone, this is who I am. This is who I will always be. Thank you all for being who you are. Thank you for doing what you do. Thank you for blessing our world. Ano ai ko ala hele. Aloha.
Thank you, Auntie Puna, for that beautiful closing of this circle in time and honoring of everyone here. And aloha. Thank you, everyone. See you next time.